January 1945, northern France, the Ardennes. A Tiger tank commander named Hauptmann Heinrich Müller crouched in the frozen turret of his Panzerkampfwagen 6, binoculars pressed against wind-burned eyes. Through the skeletal trees, he watched something that made no tactical sense. American Sherman tanks, vehicles his crew had disabled just 2 days prior, were rolling back into position, freshly painted, fully fueled, their treads grinding through ice with the confidence of machines that knew no scarcity. The metallic stench of diesel hung in the winter air, thick enough to taste. Müller lowered his binoculars slowly. In 3 years of warfare across 2 continents, he had learned to read a battlefield like sheet music. This rhythm was wrong. This tempo was impossible. 60 kilometers behind those Sherman formations, a convoy of 2,300 trucks moved through the night without headlights. Their engines formed a mechanical river that flowed from the beaches of Normandy to the bleeding edge of the Western Front. The drivers, predominantly black American soldiers of the Red Ball Express, had been driving for 18 hours straight. Their hands cramped around steering wheels. Their eyes burned from exhaust fumes and gasoline vapors. They hauled ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and above all, fuel. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline in 5-gallon jerry cans that sloshed and clanked with every pothole, every shell crater, every desperate mile. The Wehrmacht had calculated Allied logistics would collapse by autumn. It was now deep winter, and those calculations were drowning in American petroleum. The German High Command had built their invasion of France on a fundamental assumption about modern warfare. Armies move at the speed of their supply lines, and supply lines break. This was not philosophy. This was mathematics verified by 2,000 years of military history. Napoleon's Grande Armée had starved in Russia despite tactical brilliance. Rommel's Africa Corps had been strangled in the desert not by inferior skill, but by absent fuel. The panzer divisions that stormed through Poland and France had done so by capturing enemy supply depots, by living off conquered land, by moving faster than their own logistics could follow. The Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactical innovation. It was a calculated gamble that victory could be seized before the supply chain mattered. For 5 years, that gamble had paid dividends written in occupied territory. But the Red Ball Express represented something the Wehrmacht had not encountered before: industrialized abundance deployed with relentless systematic precision. The operation began in August 1944, named after railway terminology for express freight service. The Americans had designated a one-way loop of French highways exclusively for supply trucks. No civilian traffic, no military convoys except those painted with the distinctive Red Ball insignia. Trucks departed the port depots of Saint-Lô and Cherbourg every 90 seconds during peak operations. They drove in columns that stretched for miles, maintaining 40-kilometer-per-hour speeds despite roads that dissolved into mud under their weight. When a truck broke down, it was pushed to the roadside. When a driver collapsed from exhaustion, another took his place. The convoy never stopped. Hauptmann Müller had learned about supply warfare at the tank school in Wunsdorf. His instructors, veterans of the Eastern Front, had taught him that fuel was the blood of mechanized combat. A Tiger tank consumed 280 liters per 100 kilometers. The operational range was 120 kilometers on roads, 60 in rough terrain. This meant constant calculation, endless rationing. His crew had become experts at fuel conservation. They would shut down engines whenever possible, even in winter, even as the cold turned metal instruments brittle. They would roll downhill in neutral to save drops of diesel. They would abandon disabled tanks, not because of battle damage, but because recovery vehicles had no fuel to tow them. Miller had watched Tiger tanks worth their weight in strategic value left burning on roadsides because there was nothing left to feed their engines. The American approach seemed to him like madness disguised as doctrine. Sherman tanks idled their engines constantly. Reconnaissance vehicles drove in circles. Supply trucks ran their heaters through the night so drivers could sleep warm between shifts. In September 1944, German intelligence officers had captured documents from a destroyed American supply depot. The paperwork revealed something that commanders initially dismissed as enemy disinformation. The United States Army in Europe was burning 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day. 800,000. The entire Wehrmacht's daily fuel allocation for all fronts, East, West, and South combined, was barely 60,000 tons of mixed petroleum products per month. The Americans were consuming in one day what Germany carefully rationed across a week. The soldiers of the Red Ball Express understood none of the strategic implications. They understood only the mission briefings that repeated with mechanical regularity. Get the fuel forward, get it there fast, get back, and do it again. Most were soldiers from the Quartermaster Corps, units that the Army had segregated along racial lines despite desperate manpower shortages across all theaters. Black soldiers were deemed suitable for supply duties, for driving trucks, for unloading ships, for the unglamorous arithmetic of tonnage and turnaround time. They were not trained for glory. They were trained for repetition, and in that repetition, they built something that would shatter the Wehrmacht's fundamental understanding of how modern armies died. Private First Class James Anderson from Georgia drove truck number 477. His route began at the beach depots, where Liberty ships disgorged cargo faster than longshoremen could sort it. He would load 3 tons of jerry cans, 144 cans at 5 gallons each, 720 gallons of gasoline that turned his truck into a rolling bomb. Then he drove. The Red Ball route covered 320 kilometers one way. In good conditions, this took 8 hours. Conditions were never good. The French roads, already damaged by German occupation and Allied bombardment, disintegrated under the weight of vehicles they were never designed to carry. Trucks sank axle-deep in mud. Bridges collapsed. Detours added 50 kilometers to journeys already beyond the edge of human endurance. Anderson drove anyway. His shift officially lasted 12 hours. In practice, he drove until the convoy stopped, or his truck failed. He ate K-rations behind the wheel, unwrapping canned hash while steering with his knees. He urinated into empty ration cans rather than stop the convoy. He watched the truck ahead through eyes that saw the road in double vision, then triple. When he reached the forward depots, he would unload in darkness, military police shouting coordinates and unit designations while shells whistled in the distance. Then he turned around and drove back. The round trip took 16 to 20 hours. He was allotted 4 hours of sleep before the next convoy formed. This was not sustainable. This was not humane. This did not matter. The fuel moved forward. The German soldiers who faced the consequences of this logistics miracle experienced it first as confusion, then as creeping dread. Obergefreiter Karl Schmidt commanded a Panther tank in the 2nd Panzer Division. In December 1944, his unit received orders for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, which Allied historians would call the Battle of the Bulge. The operational plan was elegant in its desperation. German forces would punch through the American lines in Belgium, drive to Antwerp, cut off the Allied advance, and capture the massive supply depots that had accumulated behind the front. It was blitzkrieg strategy applied to Germany's own funeral. Schmidt's briefing officer had been explicit. You will begin with half fuel loads. You will capture American fuel within the first 2 days, or you will fight on foot. Schmidt found this darkly funny. His father had been a cavalry officer in the First World War, and the old man had stories about horses that starved before battles began. Now Schmidt drove a 45-ton tank that starved even faster. The Panther needed 700 liters to fill its tanks. He started the offensive with 350. His commander expected him to drive over 100 kilometers, engage in combat, and survive on captured supplies. It was not a military plan. It was a prayer disguised as an operation order. For 3 days, that prayer seemed answered. The German offensive shattered the American lines. Entire regiments surrendered or fled. Schmidt's panzer unit captured fuel trucks, supply dumps, and warehouses full of American abundance. He saw things that seemed impossible. Warehouses stacked with canned meat and chocolate bars, medical tents with enough morphine to supply a hospital, ammunition stockpiles that could feed an artillery battery for weeks, and fuel. Jerry cans stacked in pyramids 3 meters high, barrels arranged in neat rows that stretched beyond sight. His crew siphoned American gasoline into their Panther with shaking hands, giddy with the sudden wealth. They filled the tank. They filled emergency reserves. They filled every container they could carry. For 12 hours, Carl Schmidt commanded a fully fueled tank for the first time in 6 months. Then the Red Ball Express caught up. American tank crews learned within days where new fuel depots appeared. Radio operators transmitted coordinates to supply units who dispatched truck convoys that arrived within hours. Schmidt watched American Shermans that his unit had driven from defensive positions return the next morning, freshly supplied and reinforced. He watched P-47 Thunderbolts fly constant air patrols despite weather that should have grounded all aircraft. He watched American infantry receive ammunition resupply in the middle of firefights. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that did not understand scarcity. This was more disorienting than superior tactics or better technology. This was abundance deployed as a weapon. The psychological impact rippled through German ranks in ways that generals could not measure and propaganda could not counter. Soldiers whispered that America possessed infinite resources, that their factories could outproduce all of Europe combined, that defeat was not a question of courage or skill, but simple mathematics. They were not entirely wrong. In 1944, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, while Germany managed 40,000. American shipyards launched cargo vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. American refineries processed 2 billion barrels of crude oil, while German synthetic fuel plants, targets of relentless Allied bombing, struggled to produce 5 million tons of usable petroleum products. The Red Ball Express was simply the visible manifestation of this industrial disparity. 2 million tons of supplies delivered to the front in 81 days of operation. Private Anderson never saw the strategic implications. He saw only the road unwinding endlessly ahead, the next convoy, the next load of jerry cans. His hands developed permanent calluses from the steering wheel. His back seized into chronic pain from sitting 18 hours at a stretch. He lost 20 pounds in 3 months, despite rations that would have seemed generous in any other context. The Army did not issue medals for driving trucks. There were no glory stories about supply lines, no propaganda films celebrating men who fought sleep deprivation and mechanical failure, rather than enemy soldiers. Anderson and the other drivers of the Red Ball Express existed in the historical shadow between the beaches and the front lines, visible only as numbers in logistics reports. But those numbers told a story that terrified Wehrmacht analysts who survived to write post-war assessments. In one particularly detailed study, German military historian General Major Burkhard Müller-Hillebrand calculated that Allied logistics in 1944-1945 represented the complete industrialization of warfare to a degree that rendered traditional military strategy obsolete. He noted that American supply doctrine had inverted historical relationships. Instead of maneuver-enabling supply, supply-enabled maneuver. Tank units did not advance cautiously to maintain supply lines. supply lines advanced aggressively to enable tank units. This was not merely superior logistics. This was a fundamental reimagining of how armies functioned. The Red Ball Express officially ended in November 1944 when Allied forces captured Antwerp and its deep water port facilities. The one-way highway loop was no longer necessary. Supplies could flow directly from ships to the front without the desperate truck relay. But the operational impact lingered like smoke over a battlefield. German forces in the West never regained strategic initiative after the Ardennes offensive collapsed. They retreated not because they lost battles, but because they lost the ability to sustain battles. Panzer divisions sat immobile with empty fuel tanks. Artillery units rationed shells, while American batteries fired unlimited support missions. The Wehrmacht was not defeated. It was starved into irrelevance by an enemy that had solved the ancient problem of how to feed an advancing army. Hauptmann Müller survived the war and spent 3 years in a prisoner camp in Virginia. He worked on a farm detail, and the abundance astonished him even in defeat. The meals provided to prisoners, men who had fought against American soldiers months earlier, contained more calories than Wehrmacht combat rations. The farm equipment ran constantly, diesel fuel treated as a mundane necessity rather than precious resource. Müller watched American farmers casually discard food that would have fed his tank crew for days. He began to understand belatedly that Germany had not lost a war. Germany had lost an industrial contest that military courage could not overcome. The Red Ball Express had been a symptom, not a cause. The disease was deeper. A nation could not fight a modern war against an enemy who possessed both the industry to produce unlimited material and the systematic will to deliver it regardless of cost. The drivers of the Red Ball Express returned to an America that barely acknowledged their contribution. They received no ticker tape parades, no speaking tours, no prominent memorials. Most returned to the segregated South where they could not vote, could not eat in certain restaurants, could not sleep in certain hotels despite wearing the uniform of a victorious military. Private Anderson went back to Georgia and worked in a garage, fixing civilian vehicles for men who had never heard of the Red Ball Express and would not have cared if they had. He told his children about driving through France, but the stories felt distant even to him, as if they had happened to someone else in a different lifetime. But in the archives of military colleges and war museums, the Red Ball Express became a case study in logistics excellence. The numbers were preserved even as the names faded. 5,900 trucks, 23,000 soldiers, 12 million tons of supplies delivered across 4 months of continuous operation. Military historians studied the route planning, the maintenance protocols, the driver rotation schedules. They analyzed how the United States military had taken a segregated unit deemed unfit for combat and deployed them in the most critical supply operation of the European theater. They noted the bitter irony. Black soldiers denied full citizenship had been essential to saving a democracy that would take another 2 decades to extend them equal rights under law. The jerry can, that simple 5-gallon container that sloshed through Private Anderson's truck, became the unlikely symbol of Allied logistic superiority. German engineers had invented the design, a rectangular steel can with 3 handles, an internal breather system, and a cross-shaped indent on each side that added structural strength. When British forces captured German supplies in North Africa, they immediately recognized the jerrycan's superiority to their own fuel containers and copied the design. American manufacturers produced them by the millions. That steel rectangle, painted olive drab and stenciled with fuel warnings, represented the unglamorous truth of modern warfare. Battles were won not by heroic charges, but by mundane containers successfully multiplied and distributed faster than the enemy could destroy them. Hauptmann Müller died in 1987, an old man who had outlived his war by 4 decades. Near the end, his grandson asked him what he remembered most about fighting the Americans. Müller thought for a long time before answering. "Not the battles," he said, "not the defeats or the tactical engagements. What haunted him was the constant sound of truck engines in the distance, that mechanical drone that never stopped, never faltered, never ran dry." He remembered watching American supply convoys through his tank periscope and understanding that Germany was not fighting soldiers. Germany was fighting an industrial system that had learned to compress a factory's output into a fuel line that stretched across Europe. You could destroy individual trucks, individual depots, individual supply routes, but you could not destroy the system itself. It simply routed around damage and continued flowing forward like water through a broken dam. The Red Ball Express rolled into history as a footnote, a curiosity mentioned briefly in comprehensive accounts of World War II logistics. But that footnote carried implications that rippled through military doctrine for generations. The Soviet Union studied American supply operations obsessively, building their own version of industrial warfare that prioritized mass production over individual quality. The United States military enshrined logistics as a fundamental pillar of combat power, establishing permanent supply structures that outlasted any single conflict. The lesson was stark. In total war between industrial nations, victory belonged not to the most courageous army, but to the army that could sustain courage with unlimited material support. Private Anderson's truck, number 477, was scrapped in 1946, melted down, and reformed into peacetime steel. But on certain French highways, if you know where to look, you can still see the scars. The roads that carried the Red Ball Express were rebuilt after the war, but the foundation damage remains. Engineers paving those routes found soil compressed beyond normal density, crushed under weight it was never meant to bear. They found patches where the earth itself remembers the passage of thousands of trucks carrying fuel to armies that burned through gasoline-like air, because they came from a place where abundance was not a luxury, but an assumption, where the factory's output was measured not in careful conservation, but in relentless overflow. And in that overflow, a new kind of warfare was born, one where logistics was not the support for combat operations, but the primary weapon itself. The Red Ball Express had proven that in industrial warfare, the nation that could deliver the most supplies, the fastest, did not merely have an advantage. It had already won. The rest was simply the time required for that mathematical certainty to resolve into historical fact. The German tank commanders who watched those supply convoys rolling forward without pause, without fear, without any concern for scarcity, were not witnessing better soldiers or superior tactics. They were watching the future arrive one truckload at a time, and recognizing too late that the war had been lost not on battlefields, but in factories, oil fields, and the stubborn endurance of drivers who refused to stop moving forward no matter how exhausted, no matter how dangerous, no matter how thankless the road ahead.